Let's talk about lipids now. What are lipids? Well, first of all, lipids are usually either referred to as fats or oils, and usually fats are solid and oils are liquid. Of course, it depends on the temperature and the environment that they're in, but generally that's how we think about them. The other term you may hear used sometimes is ether extract. Ether extract, let me explain that. So remember how when I was talking about fiber, how we try to solubilize the fiber in either a liquid detergent or an acid detergent? Well, fats do not solubilize in water, right? Oil and water don't mix. However, oils will solubilize in other liquids, and one liquid that they do solubilize in is in ether. And so if I took a feed sample that was ground very, very fine, and I mix it with ether, what's going to end up happening is that things like the protein and the carbohydrates, the minerals are not going to solubilize in that ether. However, the fats will. Then what I can do is I can run that liquid, that slurry, through a filter, and the fats, because they've been solubilized, will go through the filter, but everything else will stay in the cot. Now I'll have the ether with the fat in it. I can evaporate the ether off, and I'm left with the ether extract, the stuff I was able to extract using ether, and that will be your lipids. Okay. Lipids are very high in energy. Just to give you an example, corn grain is about 3.2 megacalories of energy, whereas lipids are about 7.1. So much higher energy source in there, and that we can use that to our advantage for in high production requirements. When we have, for example, high producing dairy cows, we can add some lipids to the diet, or if we have very high growth rates that we need energy in order to attain those growth rates, for example in hogs, we can add a little bit of lipid there as well. Generally, we don't add lipids on purpose per se for sheep diets, but there's a few things that we should know about it, and there's also, I'm going to go in probably a little bit more detail than we normally discuss when we talk about sheep nutrition as well. So what are lipids again? Again, I've explained a little bit about them, but their form is usually in a triglyceride. Triglyceride is where you have 3 fatty acids. And those aren't necessarily all the same fatty acids on there, but you'll have 3 fatty acids and what's called a glycerol backbone. When glucose goes through glycolysis, one of the steps is it actually makes a glycerol, and that glycerol then is the backbone, because 3 things can come off of it, and then you get a fatty acid bonded to each of those. Okay. Generally, if it's going to be a liquid lipid like an oil, they're going to be polyunsaturated. Okay, or they're going to have shorter chain fatty acids. And I'll explain that here in a minute as well. And then our solid lipids, like our fats, are going to be saturated and have longer chain fatty acids. Okay, so here you can see the diagram I have of some different fatty acids here. Okay, and so at the top we have a saturated, and that orange one we have a saturated. All the carbon bonds have a hydrogen. They have 4 bonds coming off of them, all to separate things. Okay, so 3 hydrogens on the end one, and then 2 hydrogens and 2 carbons on every one after that, going all the way up to the carboxyl group, which is then connected to the glycerol. The glycerol is that green backbone you see there, the thing that's highlighted green. Okay, so that orange fatty acid is saturated. It's got as many hydrogens as it possibly can. Then you have what's called unsaturated. An example would be the 2 below that, but the first one is an unsaturated fatty acid, the yellow one there, and that's where we have a carbon-carbon double bond. The carbon-carbon double bond now it doesn't have as many hydrogens there. There's 2 less hydrogens on that one because of that double bond occurring on there. And that would be a mono-unsaturated, a single unsaturated fatty acid. And if I were to then put on if I had more unsaturated fatty acids, then you would have a situation where it's a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Here you can see on this diagram right here, I have a double bond, and it's 3 carbons from the end. Okay, 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbon, then the double bond. That is where we get the term omega-3 fatty acid. This carbon at the very end is called the omega carbon, and so the omega-3 fatty acid is when it has that double bond, 3 carbons from the end. Now, why is this kind of important to understand? The best way that I think I can illustrate that is actually, I got a few paper clips here. So those hydrogens actually are very, if I could use the term, sticky to other hydrogens. They'll form hydrogen bonds against each other. So picture these two paper clips that I have right here, okay? I have these 2 paper clips, and let's say they're kind of magnetic. And so when they're long and straight like that, then they will stick together. And so if I have a whole bunch of those, I can create kind of a strength with that. However, one thing that's not really well illustrated on the diagram that you're looking at is that when you start putting a double bond in, there gets to be bends in it. So now I have a bend, and so that if I have a monounsaturated, and here I have a polyunsaturated, now look at for where to line up. Okay, well they can line up right there, or they could line up here, or I guess they could line up there or there, but it's not the whole thing sticking against each other, and that's why it's less sticky, and that's why it's more liquidy. Okay, that's more liquidy, if that's even a word, but it becomes more fluid. Okay, so you understand that the polyunsaturated, the more polyunsaturated, or the shorter they are, because of course if the shorter they are, the less hydrogen bonds you're going to get as well, is going to make it more of a liquid in terms of oil rather than being a solid fat. So why, again, I've already kind of mentioned this, they provide extra energy. Okay, so they're really good for high energy demand situations like in lactation. They're really probably not a good idea to have a whole lot of fats in a diet when we have low energy situations. For example, early gestation in the EU, they really don't require a whole lot of energy. You start putting fats in their diets at that point in time, you're probably going to get situations of gaining too much condition score. If you're having trouble getting condition on them, then maybe you want to consider putting a little bit of it in there. The other thing that's important to understand, and we're going to explain that actually in another lecture as well where we talk about energy, is they have a very low heat increment. Okay, that low heat increment is an important concept to understand. Anytime we digest feeds, break down feeds, metabolize feeds, we produce heat. Okay, and that's where we get some of our heat from. That keeps us warm. Okay, keeps our bodies functioning. That heat, not all nutrients produce the same amount of heat in that heat, and that heat. By the way, that heat is called the heat increment. And so, for example, fiber produces a lot of heat. When you digest fiber and so forth, it takes a lot of energy to do that. It's a wasteful process, so it creates a lot of heat. Whereas fats have a very low heat increment. So this is why, for example, when you get hot weather out, why your animals drop their feed intakes. Why? Again, they're not consciously thinking about biologically. Their bodies are saying, it's really hot out right now. I don't want to eat so much because I'm going to create even more heat yet. And so they drop their feed intake a little bit. If you start taking a little bit of that, for example, corn grain out of that diet and put a little bit of fat in instead, you are going to decrease that heat increment, plus the fact they're going to get more energy from that fat anyways. And so you can actually bring up maybe their feed intakes a little bit, plus you can keep that energy intake where it needs to be for them. Okay, so it can be a valuable situation to consider in hot weather. Cold weather, adding a little bit more fiber to the animal's diet can actually improve their body heat and help them to stay warmer in that type of situation as well. The other thing we have to be aware of is that if we get too high levels of fat in the diet, think about the bacteria when they're in that rumen. The bacteria don't have eyes. They can't see the blade of grass. They just kind of attach to it, and as they're flowing through there, they attach to it. Once they attach to it, then they will recognize it by their chemically, and they'll start attacking it. If I have too much fat in the diet, the fat will actually coat my grass, and the bacteria comes up and says, "Oh, that's not cellulose, or that's not grass, don't know what that is," and they'll not be able to attack it or digest it. Okay, so we have to be careful that we do not feed too high levels of fat to them. It's generally been assumed that 5% is safe. Now, I do not know of this research being done in sheep. I know it's been done in cattle, and 5% is assumed there. Because it's the same bacteria, I would assume that in this situation, probably the number would be relatively similar for sheep as well. Now, there is something we're going to talk about in a minute. We can feed what's called Rumen Escape Fat, and in that situation, the Rumen Escape numbers can then go above that, bring your total fat levels above that 5% as well. So what are some of the sources of lipids that we might find in our diets? Well, dried distillers grains with solubles is probably one of the more common places we're going to find it coming into our diets and a regular sheep diet. So remember, if we have corn that goes to the ethanol plant, about a third of it ends up becoming ethanol, about a third of it becomes carbon dioxide, and about a third of it becomes dried distillers grains with solubles. The part that became carbon dioxide and the part that became ethanol was the starch, okay, the starch portion of it, and so everything else kind of concentrates. So if I had 3% oil in my corn to begin with, I'm going to have about 9% oil in my distillers grains. So 9% oil in that feed is getting to be a fairly high. Okay, you're starting to add up. You couldn't feed, for example, even 50% distillers. Not that you would ever want to feed that much, because you'd be about 4.5%, 5% of the oil right there. And remember, corn also has 3%. So if we did 50-50 corn and soybean meal, you'd be at 6% oil, right there, just between those two ingredients. So we have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes what will limit how much distillers we can put into a diet is the amount of oil that's in it. There are some moves with some ethanol plants that are now recognizing, wait a minute, we got 9% oil in here, and just down the road there's a corn plant that's removing the oil, corn oil. Now why don't we remove the corn oil from the distiller's grains? And so in that case, then it'll have low levels of oil in that distiller's grains, which will decrease its value significantly, because one of the values of the dry distiller's grains is the energy it has in it. Other things that can provide it are oil crops, for example, of course you want to roast some soybeans. Not typically something that you'd probably be feeding the sheep, but in some cases you may want to feed a little bit if they need a little bit of extra energy. And then whole canola would be another example. Vegetable oils or animal fats are other sources of lipids that can be included. Again, generally, I've kind of already mentioned this, generally oils are more expensive and unnecessary in sheep, or for that matter in beef diets. Perhaps in lactating ewe diets, if you have a dairy sheep farm or a dairy goat farm, so then perhaps maybe in some situations having some lipids in there could be helpful. If you're having a hard time keeping condition on your animals, then it's also something worth considering. One thing also, if your concentrate portion of your diet is rather dusty, and remember, dust is really bad for the animals. If that's in the air in the barn, it's going to get into their lungs and decrease their lung health, and therefore decrease their productivity. Just adding even 1% oil to a feed can really reduce dust levels in a barn and make the environment a whole lot more healthy for them. I do want to talk briefly about rumen escape fat as well. So this is again a fat that's been protected to escape the rumen. It doesn't bypass the rumen, it still goes in the rumen. However, the bacteria cannot access, and it doesn't have the same impact as the other fat does in coating the fibers. So you don't get that fat coating, and it's not broken down by the microbes. And what it essentially is it's a fatty acid, okay, just a single fatty acid, and instead of it being bonded to that glycerol, it's bonded to a calcium. And okay, so that's why it's called a calcium salt of a long chain fatty acid. Again, high energy. There you can see the net energy lactation is close to 6.5 megacals per kilogram. And again, this is expensive, so it's something that should only be used as a last resort, not something you want to be going to right away. I want to take a little bit of an aside, because this is interesting even for sheep, I think. There's some research that shows that the CLA levels in sheep meat is relatively high, and I'll show you that here in a few minutes. And one of the big interests of it is that there's cancer-fighting properties. There's potent cancer-fighting properties in CLA. And so that's why there's an interest in people consuming meats or products that are higher in CLA as well. I do see also, if you go online and you type in CLA, you're going to see a lot of chatter about having positive impact on weight loss. I found one research trial where, I'm quoting directly, they said, given a dose of 3.2 grams per day, CLA produces a modest loss in body fat in humans. Unfortunately, in order for you to get that much CLA from your dairy products, you'd have to eat a pound of butter in a day to get that much. And I just think that you probably have lost all the benefit you're going to get from the weight loss of the CLA if you're eating a pound of butter in a day. So I don't think that the weight loss thing is probably a significant gain of it. However, the potent cancer-fighting properties is something that is interesting. And it is relatively high in dairy products, and it's relatively high in lamb as well. Here you can see some numbers just to get a little bit of an idea what the concentrations are. And there you can see lamb, 5.6 milligrams per gram of fat. That's of all the meats, it's the highest in the meat, and it's the second highest in terms of only butter has a higher level than it does in terms of dairy products as well. So what's happening here? This is something that's what we would call biohydrogenation. Remember, we had those double bonds going on, and that makes it more liquidy. In actual fact, in many cases, some of those unsaturated fatty acids are actually toxic to bacteria. Naturally, they're toxic to bacteria. So the bacteria has a defense mechanism where they're going to take those unsaturated fatty acids and they want to make them saturated. Okay, so they're going to add hydrogen. That's biohydrogenation. They're going to add hydrogen to those and make them into saturated fats. In just a regular forage diet, about 90, almost 100% of the fatty acids that a cow eats are going to be unsaturated. However, only 10.7% of the fats that actually leave the rumen in that same diet would be unsaturated. They become saturated because the bacteria does that. Just give you an example to it, like when we hydrogenate oils, for example, if we take vegetable oil and we hydrogenate it, that's how we make oil into something like margarine, for example. Okay, so it makes it more, it solidifies it. Now, if that process of biohydrogenation doesn't happen to completion, you get the production of CLAs. Okay, conjugated linoleic acids. And so basically what it is, I'm going to try to bring my pointer up onto here, over here. So we have what are non-conjugated and conjugated fatty acids. If there are two double bonds that are only one single bond apart. See, this one's got two single bonds apart. That's not conjugated. Here we have only one, okay, between there. Then you would have a situation, oh sorry, this is a conjugated down here. You only have one single bond between there, and you've got the double bond right there. Those would be conjugated. They're beside each other fatty acids. And just as a little bit of a side, if you've ever heard of cis versus trans fatty acids, if those two hydrogens are on the same side, the double bond like going up, then they're called cis, and if they're on the opposite side, then they're called trans. And that's where the terms come from. And there you can see the double bond. That's another way of showing double bonds in a diagrammatic form versus this side over here. So how do we nutritionally control it? Well, pastures, basically increased consumption on pastures will increase the CLA content. More forages will increase the CLA content. The more mature forages, the less CLA. So the younger or the less mature a particular pasture or forage is, the more CLA you're going to get as well. If you're feeding plant oils, when you start feeding unsaturated, you're going to get more CLAs as well, again, because there's more oils that need to be, unsaturated fats that need the bacteria need to do that biohydrogenation with. And then you can see some plant seeds. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. You can read through those as well, or you can look up the reference and study that a little bit more if you would like. So there is also some data to show that trans fatty acids cause milk fat depression. This is not the same thing as that fat coating the fiber that I already explained. What's basically happening is some fats have varying strengths of milk fat depression. It's thought to be caused by causing a depression in de novo synthesis of fatty acids, so that the mammary gland is not making its own fatty acids. That's why it decreases milk fat. And it seems to be some trans fatty acids are stronger at it than other trans fatty acids. Again, I'm not going to go into the exact details of which ones are stronger or weaker. And it also seems to be tied to the fact that if rumen pH starts dropping. So if rumen pH drops below 6.0, that's when you start to get more of this milk fat depression occurring. You're also going to get milk fat depression if the rumen pH drops that low, just because of you're getting more propionic acid versus acetic acid. But there appears to also be something happening here with the trans fatty acids. So just in summary, fats, okay, just remember, fats are high in energy and they have a low heat increment, and that's really where their strengths lie. We have to remember though, we don't want the levels to go above 5% total in a diet. That doesn't include the Rumen Escape. If you're going to go higher with the Rumen Escape, then you can go higher than 5%, but the total non-Rumen Escape fatty acids should not exceed 5%. And again, you'd only use those Rumen Escape fats if you're having a situation like, for example, a high energy requirements like in a dairy situation. And then again, there is some evidence to show that elevated CLAs have benefits to consumers, so that's something worth considering as well.